Okay, have we gone live or we're about to? Okay, Rob, are we now live?
Yeah.
We are. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in our series of 3 events this week, where we officially launch our assessment report on business reorganization and turnaround across the EBRD regions. Our report is available on ebrd-restructuring.com. My name is Catherine Bridgesoller, and I'm a senior counsel within the EBRD's legal transition team in London. I started the preparatory work on this assessment almost 2 years ago in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, together with Professor Rodrigo Olivares Caminal from Queen Mary University of London, and a team of internal and external legal professionals. We knew that the pandemic would hit the business sector very hard. Those businesses that were already in financial difficulties would struggle further, and even the healthy corporations would need assistance. The goal of our business reorganization assessment was to map the available insolvency and pre-insolvency tools for businesses across all 38 EBRD economies of operation. We use the umbrella term reorganization to describe any process which is aimed at addressing a debtor's financial difficulties with a view to preventing insolvency and ensuring the viability of the business. A reorganization procedure often, but not always, involves the appointment of an insolvency practitioner and typically includes some protections from the business against creditors. Our assessment centralizes the most critical information on business reorganization and insolvency for every EBRD economy. A person reading the report and the 40 different economy profiles can easily identify the strengths and the weaknesses of national insolvency systems. As some of you who joined yesterday will have heard, transparency of insolvency data has been a central theme of our assessment. We have also made this part of our methodology, and all the data and the results collected by the assessment team are publicly available on our website, ebrd-restructuring.com. Often with assessments, economies are benchmarked against certain criteria and shortcomings are identified, but the assessment reports go no further. We have tried in this assessment to be a bit different and to support our cross-jurisdictional analysis with a guide on international best practices that are helpful for legislators and policymakers working in this highly specialist area. The topic of this webinar will be to explore those international trends and also to identify some reform priorities that policymakers and national authorities should be thinking of. We will begin this event with a short presentation by Professor Rodrigo Olivares Caminal, who was very much involved in the project from its inception. After his presentation, and subject to timing, there will be an opportunity for Q&A from the audience. This event is being recorded for social media, and therefore before we start our discussion, there are a few pointers for those joining by WebEx. You can put any questions you have over the course of this webinar in the Q&A section, and we will do our best to address them. If I see them as I go along and I can incorporate them into the discussion, I will do so. Otherwise, we will take them up at the end. Please do introduce yourself and your organization when you pose any question. It will help us to address your question most effectively. And also, please feel free to tweet about this event. And if you do that, if you tweet or you post on your LinkedIn profile, you can also introduce the hashtag EBRD Insolvency Report. So without further ado, I will now pass the floor to Professor Rodrigo Olivares Caminel to give you his insights into the assessment and the best practices that we have identified. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here today to share some of the findings that we managed to identify while we were conducting this assessment and based on the data that we collected. I will probably ask the technical team if they can project the slides. Thank you very much. As Catherine said, this has been a giant task, and it took us quite some time because the idea was to collect information from stakeholders in each of the economies, and the idea was to assess reorganization from two angles. One is extensiveness, and the other one is effectiveness. And this was assessed through a questionnaire where there were data gathering questions plus perception-based questions. And this has produced the assessment report that has been published. And the main purpose today is to discuss some of the main findings. So my presentation today will start with a scope of the assessment and the economies of the EBRD that have been covered, then discuss some selected themes and make some big picture observations. The idea with this is to be able to reach what is the penultimate slide on my presentation, where I have identified what are the current trends and the reform priorities. This will operate as a kind of wish list for policymakers and economists as to what are the most modern trends and what are the things that you should try to include in your insolvency legislation. And finally, some very brief conclusions to then give the floor back to Catherine to go to the second part, which will be the interaction with our guest speakers today. Please, if we can move to the next slide, please. This map here shows the different EBRD economies of operations, which are divided by the sub-regions within the bank. And these have been the ones that have been covered in the report. And what we need to highlight is that the Czech Republic has become an economy of operation, which was not at the beginning when we launched the report, and that's why it's not covered in the assessment. Next slide, please. Okay, one of the main findings in our analysis, and you will see that in my presentation, I will be showcasing some of these maps, but also in the report, you will come across these maps. The idea with these maps was to be able to come with something that we can easily identify, which is a traffic light coloring system. And this showcase what is the perception. And on this particular map, what we're looking is whether reorganization procedures are commonly used in practice in your jurisdiction. And what you see here is that the feedback is a little bit mixed, where you have some jurisdiction where there's a strongly disagreement. But if you look at this overall, between neither agree to strongly disagree, I would say that that's the majority of the colors shown on this map. So basically, the first thing is business organization commonly used, and the response is mixed, but leaning towards a no, or towards a negative perception or a negative or non being used. Now, when we compare this to the two maps I have in the next slide, so if we can move to the next slide, please, you will see that when we're trying to understand, okay, the initial question is why once we know that they are not that commonly used, then the question will be why they are not used. And that's where I think that I would like to bring to your attention the first map, which is the one that has that green is a predominant color, which is does a reorganization process carry a negative stigma for the debtor? And as you can tell, most of the map is painted green. What that tells you is that there is a high degree of negative stigma when we talk about business reorganization. So if we start linking the previous map with this one and the one that I'm going to explain now, you are see kind of a correlation in the thinking of the respondents of the questionnaire, because it's not widely used. And then we move into the reason why we say, okay, there's a negative stigma, but then then someone might be thinking, okay, yes, that's because it's a court supervised procedure. But what about if we look at private workouts, which are done? A private workout is a reorganization that is carried privately and instrumented through contract law without the supervision of a court. And that's when we move into the map on the right-hand side of my slide, the one where you see more mixed results. It's not as clear as the green one. And what you see there is that the problem that we have is that private workouts are not used either, or I feel inclined, based on the degree of orange and yellow in the map, that the overall outcome, although we have some mixed results, the overall outcome again leans towards the fact that private workouts are not commonly used. So this highlights a great, I would say, a great weakness, in the sense that business organization is not widely used. Why? Because it carries a negative stigma. And do we have an alternative, which are private workouts? And the answer that you can find on this is, the answer would be no. So if we can move to the next slide, please. On this slide, what we have here, and an important aspect to highlight, is that this is based on the perception of the stakeholders that usually resort to a reorganization procedure under the EBRD countries of operations. And when we look at what is the length of a reorganization procedure, what we can see is that most economies are on the longer end of the spectrum. What we have done this is we pose a question as to what is the average length of a procedure in your jurisdiction. And based on the percentage of respondents, 0 to 3 months, no single economy; 3 to 6 months, there were 5 economies. And then that's when we start moving towards the longer end. And again, here we follow the same approach of the traffic light system, where we have some economies that basically there are that are more than 12 months, 8 economies which are more than 12 months, and then we have the bigger block split between 6 to 9 or 9 to 12, but probably more towards the lengthier end. You can tell here that basically there are more in the block between 9 to 12 months. Needless to say, shorter the duration of business reorganization is an indicator of procedural efficiency, right? If we can move to the next slide, which this confirms to an extent many of the things that we were discussing so far. Another thing that we did within this assessment was, and for me, the perception of the stakeholders, it's very valuable because the extensiveness of the law, you can do that based on a desktop analysis looking at the law, but the perception of the end user, that's the bit which is way more difficult to obtain without conducting one of these exercises. And what we have found here is what we did was, based on the entire questionnaire, we have identified what we consider were 9 insolvency guiding principles. And this has been informed not only based on the questions, including the questionnaire, but also based on the EBRD principles for the core principles for effective insolvency. And we have grouped them for sake of simplicity under these 9 labels, which is expediency or speed of the process, high professional and ethical standards, efficiency, value maximization, transparency and access to information, negotiability, equal treatment, reciprocity, and universality. And the question along this particular aspect was, what do you identify as the principle that is lacking the most in your jurisdiction? And as you can tell, kind of in line with what have been the previous slides where I was showing the color maps and the arrow showcasing the estimated length of the procedures, is that expediency and speed ranked on top. And if we jump to the third one, which has to do with efficiency, which is closely linked to expediency, that those two are in my view, they are kind of very closely related and they go hand in hand. But it's also worth stressing that issues such as value maximization and high professional ethical standards are also areas that need to look at very carefully. I personally think that this slide is very telling for policymakers in different jurisdictions, because this is what had been identified as the issues that are mostly lacking in the economies. Can we move to the next slide, please? And before going to the conclusions, what I have tried to summarize in these 10 bullet points is what has been identified as the current trends and reform priorities for within the economies of operations of the EBRD. To reach these, what we have done is a cross-comparative analysis across the different jurisdictions, economies, but also we benchmark these against international best practices and what is the practice in some of the most developed jurisdictions. And very briefly, because I would like to go to the exchange of views with the different experts, I will just like to highlight these 10 bullet points or main takeaways, which I have colloquially reformed earlier as what will be your insolvency law wish list of any policymaker or jurisdiction. The first one is that destigmatization of insolvency. Sooner or later in the business cycle of a company, you will be faced with some kind of financial distress. It's almost unavoidable. It can be endogenous or exogenous, but the reality is that we should not fear insolvency but most importantly, insolvency as such should not have a negative stigma. It's something that all businesses alike will be facing sooner or later. And that's why we need to destigmatize and we need to see this as an unavoidable step within the business evolution. Number two, we need comprehensive, updated, and de-aggregated insolvency data. This is an issue that was extensively discussed yesterday, the issue of transparency and how there's a direct correlation between this and expediency, this and a resolution of insolvency, and not only just insolvency, but also the other closely related issue of non-performing loans. Three, specialized digitalized courts that allow for online proceedings. We have seen that insolvency as such, due to its specific nature and characterizing elements can strongly benefit from specialized commercial courts. And number 4, which has been highlighted in the previous slide where we were talking about what are the things that are lacking the most in certain jurisdictions, is professional insolvency practitioners, which should be subject to high ethical standards, continuous and ongoing training and perfectioning. Number 5, again, private workers incentives and hybrid mechanisms. One of the things that we have seen is the problem with lengthy processes that does to an extent can be one of the reasons why reorganization procedures are not commonly used, and private workers that are not a common practice in many of the jurisdictions. So I think that number 5 is also quite relevant and closely linked to some of the ones that are above, but mostly I would say with probably bullet point number 1. Another issue which is less explored in the context of insolvency is tax and regulatory incentives to encourage reorganizations. And this is something that if you receive a write-off, whether that can be considered a benefit that needs to be taxed. And these are the kind of things that sometimes put off people from being willing to try to approach a court to try to reach some kind of reorganization, because sometimes the solution ends up becoming part of the problem. And these are the kind of things that we need to look at creatively, in the sense that a rescue business can contribute more to the economy than a specific, for example, tax payment, or the same applies to some of the regulatory incentives that can be provided in this context. Number 6, and I'm conscious of the time, I'm going to be very brief. We need to have simplified and shorter procedures for nano, micro, and small, medium enterprises. These businesses are usually more than 90% of the businesses in any economy. And a couple of weeks ago, I was participating in a webinar in Spain. And basically in Spain, for example, if we add micro and small medium enterprises, we are talking about 97% of the businesses in Spain. And I'm using just as an example, but that replicates pretty much everywhere. So basically, simplified process which are less burdensome and shorter should be beneficial, and there's a lot of work being carried on, particularly at the moment in that particular area. Then moratoria and protection for essential contracts and new financing is something that can enhance or can be seen as a sweetener to come forward in a reorganization procedure. Number 9, reorganization plans need to be flexible as to how you select who needs to be restructured. So basically, what is technically referred as affected creditors, not that you are mandated, you need to do a plan for everyone. You might want to do a plan for just some group of creditors. And then the possibility of cramming down creditors, including priority and secure creditors. In certain jurisdictions, there are certain type of creditors that have super priority and need to be part of the plan, or some creditors that basically are not allowed to engage or give any type of haircut, and that has proven to be sometimes problematic. Last, and very briefly, every jurisdiction needs to bear in mind that in the globalized world that we're operating now, cross-border insolvency provisions are essential. And very briefly, just to wrap up, if we can move to the last slide, the main takeaways, and in 3-4 bullet points, are there's still a lot to be done. The EBRD and other international financial institutions are willing to help. I think that the most urgent and pressing matter is destigmatize business reorganization. And basically bear in mind that trends favor business reorganization where possible. And with that, I'm just going to point you again to and invite you to download the report, which is available online at the website that Catherine has mentioned at the beginning, which is in the penultimate bullet point there, www.ebrd-restructuring.com. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you for the time. And Catherine, back to you.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, for this very, very clear presentation overview. I can't see any questions at the moment from the audience, but I just had one up my sleeve. And I wanted to ask you, how reliable are stakeholder perceptions? So we have these very colorful and rather beautiful maps. And I just wondered how much can policymakers and national authorities rely on these? And what other things can they do to measure the effectiveness of their insolvency regime?
Catherine, thank you very much. And thank God that we are working on this together. Otherwise, the question that you would throw me is a killer, because basically, how reliable are stakeholders' perception? That's a very difficult one, in the sense that you can take it for at face value, or you can scrutinize it further. I personally think that at the end of the day, these are the end users of any insolvency law. So you can agree, you can disagree, you can have a different view, but this is the perception of the end user, for good or for bad, and that will be based on their own personal experience using the law. So that's why for me, and that's why basically, I don't know if you have noticed, basically the report has more than 100 pages, and I focus particularly on issues of perception, because these are the ones that are not easily to get from the black letter of the law. And that's why I personally put a lot of value on perception issues. Of course, one of the things that we did to verify and validate this perception is we follow it's explained the methodology that we follow, a procedure to try to make sure that there was a general degree of perception on some of the issues. What we did was we validated this with law firms in the jurisdiction, and on top of that, we looked in many of these issues. We compare and contrasted with what is the black letter on the books. But the reality is that for me, stakeholder perception is one of the most, and if not the most valuable takeaway from this report.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. I can see in the chat box a question which I'll just take now, which is around what entities participated in the survey. So we had approximately 450 responses within the EBRD regions to this survey. And I think around 68% of those were from legal professionals. And then we also had quite a high number of respondents in advisory firms and also banks. So we made sure that for each of the jurisdictions we had at least 3 responses. And actually, for some of the jurisdictions, I think Rodrigo, it was Romania that was the highest scoring, wasn't it? I think we had a very high number, and you can see this all in our report. So we've done a complete breakdown and disclaimer really on the respondents.
Catherine, we were, sorry, if I may add one thing that I have forgotten, and on your last comment, you can see everything which is available online, and we are true to what we preach. And basically, we were discussing yesterday about the issue of transparency, and yes, everything is available online on the assessment webpage. But in addition to that, we also did 5 country mission reports. 5 country missions, which what we did was we were using this to validate the information that we have collected through the assessment. Yeah. And to make sure that basically what we have collected and the perception we have received, etc., was based to what was really happening in each jurisdiction. We we selected one from each of the sub-regions of the EBRD, and we did that to validate and confirm the result that we were getting.
Yes, yes, no, thank you very much, Rodrigo. I think that's really set the scene for today's discussion, and we have a great lineup of distinguished guests for you who will share their own insights into this topic. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jose Garrido, senior counsel at the IMF and a leading expert on insolvency. And then we will be also hearing from Dr. Erica Papp, a managing partner and head of finance for Central and Eastern Europe at Cameron McKenna, Hungary. And Erica and I have had, I've had the pleasure of working with Erica recently on a reform of the Hungarian insolvency or bankruptcy legislation. Then we also have Professor Emeritus Dr. Christoph Paulus, who's an associate member of South Square and of counsel at White & Case, Germany. And Christoph can provide, I think, some very useful and valuable insights into EU level policy making. And last but not least, we have Dr. Andrzej Wojciech, the legal and policy officer at the European Commission, which, as many of you know, has been really in the last few years leading this initiative on business reorganization and what they call preventive restructuring. So I'd like to welcome all of our panelists, and I'd like to start the discussion with picking up on one of the items on Rodrigo's wish list, so hybrid procedures. Now, there's a lot of terminology in insolvency, or in bankruptcy, as some people call it. And so I'd like to start with just a definition, so it's clear what we're talking about. So by hybrid procedures, we are really talking about reorganization type procedures where most of the negotiations take place out of court. So typically, once the debtor and the necessary majority of its creditors are in agreement on the reorganization or restructuring, this reorganization plan is submitted to the court. And it's submitted for the court's approval, sometimes the court's scrutiny, and then it becomes binding on all creditors. So it's actually a very important element to have in an insolvency framework, because it's not always possible for the debtor to achieve a unanimous agreement with its creditors. This minimizing of court involvement really reduces the risk of damage to the debtor's business, negative publicity and the like. So yesterday we heard very positive that about half of EBRD's economies of operation have hybrid procedures in their insolvency frameworks. And this is being really given impetus, I think, by this recent 2019 European restructuring directive. So with that sort of background in mind, I'd like to turn now to Erica. Erica, could you please tell us a little bit about Central and Eastern Europe, where you're working and active? Are hybrid procedures part of the culture? What is the situation around private workouts? Are they as uncommon as perhaps Rodrigo's presentation would have us believe? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Catherine. There are such hybrid procedures in CE, and they will be even more relevant after the pandemic and once the loan moratoria are lifted. It is very fortunate that the new preventive restructuring directive is taking effect from the 1st of July this year. So that's one of those hybrid procedures that everyone is very much looking forward in CE. I must say that this is a fantastic new opportunity, for European and particularly CE countries, because we can modernize our hybrid procedures with this new directive. We all in CE have different insolvency laws, and some of them are quite antiquated. For example, the Hungarian law is dated from 1991. But CE economies have developed significantly in the last 10, 15 years, and there is a real need for this new type of procedure. Reorganization type procedures currently, if we are not talking about the new directive, are mainly based on civil law contracts. But as Rodrigo rightly pointed out, and it's also clearly in the report, that this is mainly available for large companies. And there is not much of a protection for SMEs, unfortunately. And as we will probably touch upon later, SMEs cannot fully benefit from the current legal regime in CE and in Europe. So just jumping back to the new directive, I had the honor of working for EBRD in this Hungarian project, which was aimed at creating a new insolvency legislation in Hungary, and we have been advising Hungarian authorities together with EBRD on the best international insolvency practice. And so within this framework, the EBRD was also requested to assist in Hungary's implementation of the Preventive Restructuring Directive. So as a result of this, Hungary is proud to be the first CE country where the directive has been implemented. We have the new law, and this will take effect in 1st of July. Some of the countries are not so developed. We have had parliamentary elections in CE in many countries last year, and therefore the legislative processes were slightly protracted. But in almost all of our countries, there is some sort of a draft law implementing the new restructuring directive, and some of the countries have already passed this law, and it is just waiting to be subject to final confirmation. So all in all, the new directive will be a fantastic step forward for CE countries in terms of hybrid procedures.
Thank you very much, Erica. I'd like to turn now to you, Andres, and ask you. You've been very much part of this and directive, which on preventive restructuring, which we're now seeing take effect within EBRD regions. Are we heading for a less court-supervised era? What is your view on this, and also the role of the court generally in reorganization type procedures?
Thank you very much. We tried with the restructuring directive in 2019 to make the involvement of the court as small as possible, only when it's absolutely necessary, when there are decisions about third parties' rights, which are or can be in certain way limited. So this was the intention to dejudicialize the pre-insolvency procedures, the preventive restructuring. We also, so if we can call this proceedings under the restructuring directive hybrid proceedings, and I think we can, we also wanted to make it available to people and businesses in all countries of the European Union, because before often there was some kind of insolvency tourism towards countries where the less formalized hybrid proceedings were more common and more useful. So we wanted to allow persons that they can use the insolvency proceedings and pre-insolvency proceedings, in particular the restructuring, in each of the countries of the EU, and they do not have to travel to another country, have it there, and return back with the judgment on it. So member states are all busy transposing the directives. Most of them will do it by July of this year. And I think with what we have in in the economy where the post-COVID or COVID aid is slightly sort of being removed or being down, I think this can help a lot to allay any possible economic shocks or post-COVID economic shocks which may arrive to the economy.
Thank you very much, Andrzej. No, that's very interesting. I'm just wondering if you wanted to respond at all to Erica's point about SMEs maybe not being able to benefit currently, or perhaps national authorities not yet opening this up to SMEs. Would just be interested to hearing your position there on that point.
Well, we are aware that the restructuring, the preventive restructuring, is mostly for the larger businesses, but we still in the Commission working on a new initiative in the insolvency area, which we announced for 2022, when we are looking into different possibilities how to make the insolvency proceedings in the EU for SMEs more simplified, probably to follow some of the or get inspiration from those countries such as Kosovo, which you have who already have some kind of simplified proceedings. But it's not going to be easy. We're doing the ordinary impact assessment. We're checking which of the instrument to use would be most acceptable, because also once we use the competence in the EU, for example, for regulation of SMEs, there is no more competence for member states to do the same. So we need to be, and we are aware of it, extremely careful on how we deal with the subsidiarity problem which we are facing always during these times. But it is something, or the regulation, more simplified regime on SME, we are looking into now.
That's very interesting, Andrzej, and that's something that we will be following with great interest. I'd just like to ask I would like to come back to this point on SMEs, and I want to also get some input on that from Christoph. But before we do, I just wanted to maybe explore this relationship between hybrid procedures and workouts very briefly. Now, what we've seen is that we have within the EBRD regions apparently an issue, because private workouts are not that common, but at the same time, business reorganization, and I would include hybrid procedures in that broadly, is not a popular choice. So I just wonder, Jose, from you've been looking at insolvency now for you looked at it for the World Bank and also now the IMF, and you cover much bigger geography. What is your view here? I mean, can we have hybrid procedures without having a culture of private workouts?
Thank you, Catherine. Look, I think the way that reorganization is used in the EBRD report is very broad. So you're basically including all kinds of techniques and procedures to keep a business alive. In that spectrum, there are a lot of different solutions and procedures, and that go from the purely informal to the full reorganization under judicial control. And in the middle, there's the hybrid. So I do believe hybrid restructuring is very useful. We've been saying this for many years. So actually, we're very glad that this is a trend, because in the end, this is about how many tools you have to address a problem. And not all of these procedures are functionally equivalent. They are better at doing some things than other things. So for instance, if you really need to restructure your workforce and your business line and change all your contracts with your suppliers, most likely you are going to end up before the judge in a full reorganization. If you just need, for instance, to have some breathing space from your creditors, probably you can do that just doing a private workout. So all of these tools, they have different purposes, they have different functions. The more tools you have, the better possibilities you have to save businesses. And I think there's another point too, and it's that culturally, for many countries in the EBRD area, it's much easier to accept hybrid restructuring than out of court. We saw this, for instance, in the Asian crisis. It was easier to promote out of court restructuring because that fitted well with the Asian culture. In Europe, and we saw this in the euro area crisis, all creditors wanted to have some certainty that there would be some judicial decision that would basically put a stamp of approval on restructurings. So there's a reason for the rise of hybrid restructuring in this region, I think in many parts of the world too. But finally, I would like to say something from the IMF perspective. What concerns us the most, obviously, is economic crisis. What we have observed in many crises in the past is that sudden collapse of the corporate sector basically creates overload of the courts, and that delays of the procedures. Basically, it makes reorganization impossible. What you will have is slow motion liquidations. So the good thing about hybrid restructuring is that you rationalize the use of the court. You can reserve the court for the most serious cases, and in most of the cases that don't need such a intense intervention, you can actually rationalize that use of the court for particular points in the procedure. So that's more or less the idea. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Jose. That's I think for those insights. I like that expression, to rationalize the use of the courts, and I'd like to now pass the ball to Christoph. Christoph, so what are your views on what the others have said, and do you think do you think that these hybrid procedures are they only for more sophisticated debtors, or do you think they have wider application or should have wider application?
Before I give an answer to that, and then before I ask you how much time you give me for that answer, I think it's Rodrigo who wanted to say something to what Jose just said. Rodrigo.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, Rodrigo. I thought you were clapping at a. I mistook the hand sign. Apologies.
Clap at Andres before. I clapped at Andres before, but Catherine, just one quick question or follow up to Jose, if I may. Jose mentioned that we want to have different tools, and I would like to see, Jose, basically what's your reaction to this, because I agree entirely with you when we talk about different type of tools. So basically have the full menu, private work counts, hybrid, and full court procedures. But we also encounter some jurisdictions that they have either too many procedures within the same type, and that has made it too complex and has been putting some people off. So it's just to see what is your reaction to that.
Very quickly, because I'm mindful that Christoph wants to say something really important. No, I agree with that view too. I think when for years I was actually analyzing a European country, and was criticizing always that there were just too many restructuring procedures, and I don't think people appreciated that view. But I mean, there's a point where there can be too many, and I think what you have to ask yourself is, are these procedures providing something different than the others don't? I mean, is this bringing something new? Is this bringing some functionality that we don't have in the other one? If in the end, I mean, multiplying procedures that don't have an evident purpose is not particularly useful, and I agree, they really confuse the users. Particularly the users of the system feel really overwhelmed by the choice. Thank you.
Thank you. Kevin, if you allow, I just jump into answering the question. To begin with, Andres has said, I'm a little bit more skeptical about this directive, because I was there in early 16, in January 16, when the expert group was meeting, and the beginning was full of the sentiment that there should be a procedure for the small and medium size, even more for the smaller ones. We were not talking about the N and Ms, the nano and micro, but we were talking about the SMEs. And for that reason, we wanted to keep the judges and the courts out to the extent possible. And then in the course of the discussion, and then even more afterwards, when it was in the machinery of the authorities, of the Commission and the Parliament, the influence increased, and that was, among others, I mean, why should I shy away from saying it? It was also the influence of lobby work, of course, that it became more proceduralized. And that brings me to answering your question, the second part of your question, is it for small or just for the larger ones? In the end of the day, it is beneficial primarily for the larger ones because they can afford to have the sophisticated advice from expensive lawyers. I mean, that is, in the end of the day, that what counts. It is nevertheless usable by the smaller. I don't know if by the N's and the M's, which Rodrigo mentioned, which is still a huge proportion in the European countries, if it's feasible for them, because you have to do some homework and you have to really concentrate on what you want to achieve, what your own situation is, and then to align it with the requirements of the law. So insofar, it's not useless. It's good that we have this instrument, but it's contrary to what we initially had in mind. And I understood the Commission had it also in mind that we do that we prepare primarily an instrument for the small and medium ones. This is, in my understanding, not the case.
No, that's very interesting, and I think this really neatly dovetails into the next theme, which we really wanted to explore. I'm conscious of time, so I'd ask panelists to keep their interventions short. But Christoph, could you perhaps maybe set out, I mean, your views here? What would some of the policy reasons be for focusing on SMEs at the moment? You know,
I mean,
there's clearly a lot of interest on, you know, having maybe a separate regime for SMEs. Why should policymakers be thinking about the SMEs?
First of all, you have it in your report, which, by the way, it should be mentioned. It's an excellent report, and I would strongly encourage the entire audience to read it, or at least to have a look at it. It's a fantastic piece. It's eminent. It's of eminent importance, and I hope I have the time afterwards to say a few words about the cultural thing that Garrido, that Jose rightfully mentioned, because that's an issue. I mean, you said it, it's 99% of the European economy, and I think Rodrigo has it on his slides. They are making something like 64% of the turnaround of entire Europe. We have one thing. I mean, this is where I'm old enough, I can do it, and the others should hear away. And I'm in the age in which I can say that we lawyers are fantastic people. However, if we are too many, we are creating damage. And the damage that we are creating is that we invent new constraints, new rules, new I don't know what, which makes it more and more unattractive for young people to create startups. I mean, it's a simple fact. If you look in Germany, which after all is occasionally called the motor of the European economy, if you look at the new foundations of businesses, it's declining during the last 20 years. It's constantly going down. And I mean, that is something they are feeding us. The lawyers are advising, they are helping, they are controlling, and all of this, but they're not creating per se some value. This is done by the business, and therefore I think it's necessary that we do something for keeping alive the business attitude and appetite among people.
Thank you, Christoph. I mean, just turning to you, Jose, do you think also that having, you know, regimes or procedures available, part of the toolkit for SMEs, is also important for innovation and just general economic development and prosperity? What is your view?
Thank you. I agree. It's a positive thing to have also tools for micro and small enterprises. I mean, if I can follow with the analogy of the toolbox, it's not that you're expected to fix everything with a wrench of the same size. So I think this is maybe what is happening with the insolvency system. But I think we have had very extensive discussions at different international fora on this, and I think the debate is really about micro and small. Nano, I had not heard before, but of course, I'm very glad to throw that into the mix. I think medium enterprises is a different issue. I think if an insolvency system is not working well for medium enterprises, there's a serious problem. That insolvency system needs to be revised, because if you look at the data, most insolvency cases in any system affect medium enterprises. So the insolvency system really needs to work mainstream for medium enterprises. And then you can have small procedures or simplified procedures for micro and small enterprises. Now, I say it's positive, but I also have to say that I don't think it makes such a big impact. And because I think that the reorganization was invented when we had the first major industrial companies. We invented reorganization with the railway companies, with the electric companies, because there's a lot of going concern value there that needs to be protected. Now, in most micro and small enterprises, there's no going concern value. And you wonder, what is the right course of action? Maybe the right course of action is actually liquidate, start something new, which is what most startups would do. By way of example, I mean, in the US, during the crisis, during this coronavirus crisis, there are about like 30 million SMEs in the US, right? And I think there's calculations that about 9 million experienced distress, loss of revenue. 6 million received help from the state, right? And in the middle of this, we have a new small business reorganization procedure. You know how many cases we have had since it started? About 2,000. Okay, and is that good or bad? I mean, I think it's positive. There are 2,000 enterprises that probably have been saved thanks to this procedure. But we have to put things in perspective. And most of the small businesses probably won't be safe. And maybe it's not the ideal approach to put everything in there so that actually can be saved. I mean, maybe that in the end is not going to work out. Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you very much, Jose, for that. It's food for thought. And I'd like to turn to Erica and just ask you, you know, from what you see in private practice. I mean, I don't know from the CMS perspective, do you work for do you have many clients who are SMEs, or are you able to gauge in a way the kind of issues that SMEs might be up against in your sort of Central and Eastern European region? You're on, I think you're on mute. And we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yes, thank you.
So thank you very much, Catherine. I think a very, very small part of our business is SME reorganization. And I think this is for two reasons. One of them is that truly advisors' fees, obviously lawyers' fees, valuation fees, and all sorts of fees are payable in any sort of reorganization process, and SMEs are simply cannot afford to pay those fees. So that's one of the problems. And the other problem is is that the small business owner is very knowledgeable about their own business, which may be a bookshop or which may be a restaurant, but obviously they are not financial reorganization experts. And therefore, they are going into the process without the necessary knowledge and without the necessary information to make some decisions regarding the continuance of their business. And in this respect, I think the new directive has these early warning indicators, which are fantastic for SMEs, because I think what the plan is, for example, in Hungary, that they will put together a set of early warning indicators, put it on a website of the Ministry of Justice, and an SME owner can check it out. What needs to be done? Am I in financial difficulty? So there are some tools, but still there is a lot of problems with SMEs' access to reorganization.
Thank you very much, Erica. That's I think that's very useful background. And Andres, I'm just wondering from your perspective, listening to this debate, you know, what is your view to this point, also raised by Jose around reorganization versus liquidation? I mean, are there some cases where we really have to say liquidation is maybe for policy reasons is the best option?
Apparently, in situations where you as a business which is pre-insolvent or insolvent, you're too small to be able to cover the costs of relatively high priced of a legal or economic professional which would advise you how to restructure. Of course, the alternative to this is you liquidate and you start again. So we also were mindful of this. So if the directive is called often the restructuring directive, but there is also another part of it which is about new start of entrepreneurs and concerns also the discharge of their debts. So we were also thinking of this situation where you have no other choice than to liquidate the business, no possible prospect of restructuring. And in order to be able to start again, we try to set conditions, and we managed to do that, where we would shorten the discharge periods for honest entrepreneurs who went bankrupt and who want to start again. Because when we had a look at the situation, for example, in the United States, where with all the procedures you could start and fail business and come back again in about let's say 4 years, effectively, if you are in your productive life for 30, 40 years, it makes you possibility of 10 opportunities, 10 options to do a business. Now you multiply that by number of persons who are economically active, and you have the number of possibilities, number of vibrations of the economy. Whereas in the EU, where we had the stigma for failed entrepreneurs, where you were in liquidation, which was once in life and end of story. So we had basically 10 times less used economic potential than the US. So we were trying within the restructuring directive also to put there where it is not possible to do otherwise than to liquidate, to be able to quickly restart and use the economic potential of businesses and persons.
Thank you very much, Andres. I think that's very insightful, and I think it takes us to the final theme I'd like to explore with all our panelists today, which is around stigma. And I can see a question in the chat box from Dr. Aurelio Aguera Martinez talking about stigma. I mean, this is still very much alive, as we've seen from the stakeholder perception maps that have been presented by Rodrigo. And in fact, in some countries, debtors can still go to prison for a bounce check. It's not, and unfortunately, it's not totally uncommon. So I'd like to perhaps turn to you again, Christoph, just to ask you, why is it the case that business reorganization, I mean, reorganization, which is meant to be about rescue and continuation of the business, why is it tainted with so much stigma when when it offers the second chance and I think for the reasons very well expressed by Andres, second chances or third or fourth chances are actually very important. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I've written extensively on this issue. All what comes to my mind as an explanation is history. I mean, we have 2,500 years, and those who are lawyers among those who are listening to this might remember, should remember, to their university times when they heard ancient Roman law. It was 2,500 years the habit that you killed. The creditors were allowed to kill the debtor. And this was kept alive until 250 years ago. In the UK, for instance, you could put the debtors into jail and you could occasionally kill them. And that was introduced by various kings, and then it was abolished again, and then it was reintroduced. So that is very, very strong. I mean, it's surprising to hear in this context that in the Old Testament, which is always tainted with the feeling that it's a brutal book, they had the habit of discharge after 7 years. So the Middle East region, the Codex Hammurabi had it as well. And they had a completely different tradition. It was not revenge, the killing. It was something, well, this happens, and we have to find a solution. And that was usually 7 years. Sometimes in the Codex Hammurabi, it's sometimes even just 5 years. And then it's over. So we are struggling with this eminent tradition. If I may add a word about the cultural background, because that makes me nervous in this context, what Jose said before. Rodrigo, when I look at your map and when I have still before my eyes this huge Russian red streetlight red of there is no habit of entering into out-of-court agreements. When I correlate this with what I heard about Russia, I don't know where else it exists. This educational principle that he who pays is a coward. So if you have this habit, what the hell can law do in this context when it makes you a macho thing? It makes you a man if you don't pay. Now the hybrid proceeding is offering you can go to the court, and then the judge for you is saying, no, he doesn't pay. What does it mean under these circumstances? I don't know exactly. But this is something what I think should be kept in mind. Instead of just looking at the rule making, there is also the cultural background, the educational. I mean, if this is in the genes, it's extremely hard to get it out of them.
Thank you very much, Christoph. I'd like to turn to you, Erica, because we talk often about the stigma that that debtors feel or face with with insolvency and financial difficulties. Is it only for debtors? I wonder if you have any insights there. Oh, I think you're on mute possibly, or it's frozen.
Sorry if the question was me. Could you repeat? I had a small freezing of that, and I didn't have exactly the question.
It was actually a question for Erica, but I think she's having connection difficulties, and so I will simply pass to you, Andres, and just ask you a little bit about maybe to pick up where Christoph left off on stigma, and maybe to ask you as what is the role here of legislators? I mean, do you think you can legislate away stigma? I think the EU Preventive Restructuring Directive talked about preventive restructuring. You've obviously limited now, tried to limit or reduce the discharge period for entrepreneurs. I mean, what can legislators do?
I believe that legislators can do a lot. When we were starting with the discharge and the period, we were asking, is some kind of financial education of person not sufficient for dealing with that? But very quickly we realized that you need hard legislation, hard time period, which we put no more than 3 years, so 3 years or less. And we see that over the past decades, the discharge periods were shortening in all countries, and the conditions for the discharge were getting less strong. So what we tried was to find some kind of compromise between countries who in the EU had discharge period up to 1 year and who had up to 7 or even 10 years in certain countries, and working this down and doing a legislation saying you can't go beyond 3 years is still in some countries a cultural change. I would say even insolvency related revolution, because releasing persons from debt is still something that people are not used to, and taking the debt as a punishment, or as a Schuld in German, as something which is morally wrong.
That's really that's really interesting. I think I'm conscious of time. The clock is ticking, but I would really just like to hear briefly from Erica on this issue of stigma, because I think we discussed that maybe it's not just limited to debtors. So it would be really great just to hear your views, and if I could ask you just to be as brief as possible. Thank you.
Absolutely. Can you hear me now, Catherine?
Yes.
Okay, so I think stigma is also very severely affecting banks, because I remember that in the 2008-9 crisis, there were several banks who had to go through a huge amount of financial restructurings, and they had to suffer severe losses, and those banks were stigmatized, unfortunately, even in the banking communities, and they have had a hard time attracting workforce. They have had reputational issues. So I think it's not only the debtors, but clearly the banks are also suffering from stigma as well.
Thank you very much, Erica. Jose, just to bring you in on this debate, is it all about stigma? Is that the reason why we're having so many difficulties, with business reorganization procedures? We're seeing a lot of usage in some countries. What's your view?
Thanks. First, I want to say that banks are debtors too, so that but that explains the issue, I guess. But for me, I think I would try to contribute something on stigma, but I find it a bit difficult. It's a very difficult concept to grasp. It's culturally affected, very different in different parts of the world, but it exists everywhere. And even in the US, there's a stigma attached to bankruptcy. What I would say is that, first, this is a different debate for personal bankruptcy and for corporate bankruptcy. And there are, of course, shades in the middle, like when you have a partnership, when you have a family company, that clearly has some stigma. But when you have a large company, I think it's a different issue. And I would also say that there's a kind of inverse relationship between stigma and formality. So if you really need to go to the court, and you really need to basically explain to the whole world your finances and accept the supervision of a court-appointed official, that is by itself is kind of humiliating. But when you are engaging in a restructuring negotiation, which is informal with major financial creditors, it doesn't necessarily have to be. So this is also correlated to this spectrum of formality and informality. If you end up in court, definitely it's not a pleasant experience for anyone, and I think that stigma will always exist in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jose. And I think I'm conscious of the time, and we're now, I think, at the end of today's session. So I'd really like to thank all our panelists, and of course, Professor Rodrigo Olivares Caminel for all his support with the assessment and for the excellent presentation. Our business reorganization assessment reports has clearly identified some valuable lines of inquiry for policymakers in all EBRD economies of operation, and also beyond. I think hybrid procedures, which provide for some light touch court involvement, are a central focus, and especially important, as Jose indicated, in times of economic crisis. And policymakers really should be thinking about SMEs, how to make sure the insolvency procedures work for them. At the same time, there is definitely a need to think about how to tackle negative stigma. I think one of the questions we were asked by a member of our audience is what type of legal, institutional, and educational policies can be developed. That's something which we really would like to explore and think about, because it does remain a significant issue. So I'd like to remind everyone that our report is available on our website, ebrd-restructuring.com, and that tomorrow we have another event which will look at the results of the assessment in a much more regional focus, particularly looking at Central Asia and our Southern and Eastern Mediterranean region. So thank you everyone for joining today. It was great to see such turnout, and we look forward to welcoming you again to more webinars on this assessment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.